You know, a lot's been written about Doom. Reviews, blog posts, GDC postmortems, and entire books. I don't think I'm going to be able to top any of them in a short-form video essay, so instead this week I think I'm going to go with more of a glowing, Tim Rogers-esque ode to one of my favorite games. Doom wasn't the first FPS game by any stretch of the imagination. There was Wolfenstein, or Wolfenstein if you're pedantic, there was Catacombs 3D, there was even Battlezone way back in 1980, and plenty of others that could arguably take the title of first FPS game ever. Wikipedia has a long list for those interested. Doom also wasn't very smart, even for its era. By 1993, we had seen games like Ultima present meaningful quests for enlightenment, and games like Civilization provide multiple factions to ally or go to war with, and multiple win states to chase after. In the review of the game in 1994, Edge stated if only you could talk to these creatures, then perhaps you could try and make friends with them, form alliances. Now that would be interesting. The idea of a game where you just run around and shoot people was old hat, even 20 years ago. It also got its name from, of all things, a Tom Cruise movie about pool sharking. I mean, it's an appropriate enough name, don't get me wrong, but it's just a really weird place to pull a name for a game about shooting space demons.
What you got in there? In here? Doom.
So, what made Doom so damn special? Why do I care about it so much 18 years after its release? First of all, and I know I harp on this a lot, but the game just feels right to play. You know how the original Super Mario Bros. Still holds up despite a sea of copycat 2D platformers on the NES because it captured the core mechanics of jumping so perfectly that first time out? That's what Doom did for first-person shooters. Compared to Wolfenstein and other FPS-style games that came before it, Doom was dark, loud, and visceral. Wolfenstein's weapons felt like pop guns next to the crazy armaments like the BFG or the now famous Super Shotgun.
Oh.
All of them had a kick and punch to them that helped emphasize the power part of this sophomoric empowerment fantasy. The game was also incredibly fast. Play Doom for a few hours and then load up any modern shooter. You'll be shocked at how slowly your character moves in comparison. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Doom was designed around projectile avoidance and circle strafing to enable skilled players to avoid most if not all damage, where modern shooters are more about using cover to avoid a certain density of damage per second, but I digress. The point is that the game empowered the player not only through meaty combat mechanics, but incredibly fast and tight movement mechanics that made playing it as much ballet as bare-knuckle brawl. It had rooms just recognizable enough to let your mind run wild with what they could really represent, but also low fidelity enough to support the nightmare landscapes they would often open up into without skipping a beat. You know how darkness and cinematography can be used to make a scene more creepy in a movie by letting you not see the monster? The low visual fidelity adds something similar here, letting your imagination arrive at conclusions about your environment, your enemies, and what they've been doing that are far more terrifying than anything the developers could have explicitly made. It's why, even though the game's engine is almost 20 years old, that the Ghouls Forest 3 mod can still be terrifying. And the actual designs of the levels are interesting, each one toying with the setting, the layout, the themes, or the mechanics. Dead Simple has a tight, symmetrical layout that tested your mettle against Mancubi in close quarters. Gotcha featured a fight between a cyber demon and a spider mastermind and is arguably a rare set-piece moment in Doom's design. Some levels were mazes, others were coliseums. Some levels featured one type of ammunition more heavily than others, forcing you to limit your approach. Some levels toyed with different combinations of monsters and items, like Tricks and Traps, where a cyber demon and a room full of Hell Knights waited for you with an invulnerability sphere to even the odds. My point is that the game worked. The level design was creative and playful and emphasized the mechanics, and the mechanics were simple and easy to get into, but still provided a fair degree of strategizing and skill. And all of that's really cool. But really, as I grow older, I find the reason I love the game so much is because it's a type of game we don't see much anymore, at least not by major studios. And no, I don't mean first-person shooters. I mean it's a personal labor of love by those who developed it. Not that developers working on modern games don't care about their projects. Believe me, when you're working 60 to 80 hours a week to shove a game out the door, knowing that upon release your continued employment is dependent on the game's sales numbers, some part of you has to make that personal. But these days you're part of a 200-man team, and every art asset or game mechanic has an entire content creation pipeline behind it, with countless hands touching your work and signing off on it after the fact. Look at Rage, whose core development and voice acting credits amount to around 165 people if Moby Games is to be believed. And that's not including the dozens and dozens of Bethesda marketing, business, legal, community management, distribution, localization, and QA staff that also had a hand in the game's production. It may have only been 20 years, but the staffs of game design studios are literally an order of magnitude larger than they were when Doom was created. And this matters because when you play Doom, you get a really strong feel for the guys who made the game. A group of 20-somethings and one 38-year-old in the early 90s, with an interest in D&D, science fiction, heavy metal music, and action movies, all skewed by an early 90s Gen X sense of nihilism. Doom is a product of their age and their interests, and even their sense of humor.
When the game was filmed, John Romero.
For starters, just look at the logo. The boxy yet slightly serif lettering is reminiscent of AC/DC's logo, but the elongated letters at either end reflect the lettering used by Metallica. And even the cover of the game harkens back to death metal album covers. The demonic imagery, the violence, the nightmarish dreamscape, it fits in perfectly with any number of hard rock covers released well before the game's production. And as long as we're on the subject of musical influences, I couldn't let the music itself go by without comment. Now, I'm not the first to compare Doom's music to its inspirations, but since I'm late to the YouTube party here, I figured I'd link to a bunch of other people who have gotten there first and basically done my research for me. If you want to see more in-depth comparisons of Doom music to their inspirations, click any of these. That said, here's some examples of how Doom music made loving homages to heavy metal if you're being generous, and basically ripped it off if you're not so nice. The story, such as it is, invokes H.P. Lovecraft. A team of scientists on Mars find an ancient alien artifact and it starts spewing out evil beings. The truth behind which would rend your fragile perception of reality and fracture your thoughts between the 7 elder planes with visions of arcane elder beings whose eldritch tongue holds no word for mercy. Okay, it's not as scary or tinged with as much xenophobic racism as Lovecraft, but the theme of science uncovering an insane, dark, universal secret that man was never meant to know, and having evil cosmic beings from beyond make all involved pay for the mistake, is certainly a running theme in Lovecraft's work. The military-based setting and Space Marine protagonist invoke James Cameron's Aliens, and the merger of biological flesh and cold steel throughout the enemies, and even some of the biomechanical wall textures, invoke H.R. Giger's Alien and other designs. The Cacodemon is probably the biggest giveaway to id's D&D fandom. First of all, the thing is basically a beholder, a floating head with a bunch of eye stalks and one giant eye in the center of its face. But its art is also taken from, or at least inspired by, this art for an astral dreadnought from the cover of the Manual of the Planes. And as I mentioned, the game seems to relish pointless violence. It's a bloody aesthetic brought on by an era of excess, full of horror films defined by slasher flicks.
Clear!
And action films with as much gore as modern horror films. All of these things, the heavy metal music, the sci-fi horror setting, the pointless violence and excess, it all permeates every inch of the game. Now go back and look at Rage. The weird thing here is that it still feels like everyone had a say, but everyone's say is extremely limited or compromised. The result is a game whose influences are all either superficial or muted by the 30 other influences, voices, and inspirations that drive the game. There's a Lost reference or two, but the game certainly doesn't try to evoke Lost. There's also influences from Fallout, and Mad Max, and Star Wars, and Mario Kart, and even old id games. The game is at once a racing game and a shooting game and a showpiece for new rendering technologies. Now, I'll get around to a proper Rage video eventually. I actually think it's sort of underrated to a degree. But the point I'm trying to make is that as an object of expression, Rage buckles under the stress of being pulled in so many directions at once. There's very little cohesion to the whole project, either because too many people were involved or because of an inability to agree on a single creative direction. By contrast, Doom's vision was so laser-focused that it actually caused Tom Hall to leave when he realized the company wasn't willing to include most of his ideas. Well, that and throwing away months of his work and ignoring his pleas for a lighter tone on the next game that it made and then asking him to resign when he became disgruntled. Yeah, that kind of sucks. The point is that id didn't make Doom because shooters were big that year and they needed to hit quarterly expectations by achieving maximum penetration in target demographics. They made Doom because it was the game these 10 or so guys had inside of them. Really, Doom has more in common with the indie games of today than it does with the modern first-person shooter, despite the mechanical similarities. Look at how you get a sense of who Edmund McMillen and Tommy Refenis are by playing Super Meat Boy. The sorts of games they like, their sadistic and scatological sense of humor, their technical proficiency and attention to detail. Or look at the way Viva 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 V and the rest of the cover of the game letter cover invokes HP in one giant the point is that it to agree on a single creative direction. By contrast, Doom's vision was so laser-focused that it actually caused Tom Hall to leave when he realized the company wasn't willing to include most of his ideas. Well, that and throwing away months of his work and ignoring his pleas for a lighter tone on the next game that it made and then asking him to resign when he became disgruntled. Yeah, that kind of sucks. The point is that id didn't make Doom because shooters were big that year and they needed to hit quarterly expectations by achieving maximum penetration in target demographics. They made Doom because it was the game these 10 or so guys had inside of them. Really, Doom has more in common with the indie games of today than it does with the modern first-person shooter, despite the mechanical similarities. Look at how you get a sense of who Edmund McMillen and Tommy Refenis are by playing Super Meat Boy. The sorts of games they like, their sadistic and scatological sense of humor, their technical proficiency and attention to detail. Or look at the way Viva 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 V and the rest of Terry Kavanaugh's oeuvre conveyed his sense of nostalgia for early C64 and Amiga titles through carefully selected and manipulated visual styles. One of the strongest features of indie games, well, most indie games, is that they're such personal projects that they can't help but be infused with a bit of their creators. When I play Doom, I don't just see a game about blasting hellfiends with shotguns, or even a finely balanced, well-paced, beautifully crafted action game. Although it is both of those things. I see a bunch of 20-something kids in jeans and t-shirts, hunched over their computer terminals in the office at 3 a.m., while Metallica and Judas Priest blare out a stereo in the corner. I see late-night D&D games buried in pizza and soda cans, and high school readings of Lovecraft and teenage viewings of James Cameron's Aliens made manifest. I come away from Doom feeling like I know at least a little bit about who these guys are. For all its pointless violence and a complete lack of a plot, Doom is a personal statement about its developers by its developers. And in that, it has more meaning than most AAA games I've played in years. And that's why, a little over 18 years later, I still enjoy the heck out of Doom. Not just because it's an awesome game, but because it conveys a snapshot of its developers' lives when they made it.
Be honest, viewers, did you click on this video thinking it was an old one, being belched up from the archives by the YouTube algorithm? All hail its benevolent wisdom, may it ever smile upon us. Well, this may surprise you, but it isn't. It's a new one. And I just never got around to doing a retro review of Doom at any point in the last 14 years of bitching every time a shooter dropped the main character's walking pace to below the land speed record. Partly because it's such a linchpin of PC shooters, reviewing it feels like reviewing, I don't know, Gravity. 3 out of 5 stars, it's nice the way it stops us floating off to die in space, slightly disappointing what it does to my waistline. But with everyone waiting for Doom Eternal to blow their verrucas off, I thought this would be a good time to take a look back at where the hype all began, to a better time when more than one fucking game worth talking about came out in Q1. Doom was released by id Software in 1993 and was a culmination of two significant events: John Carmack creating a revolutionary new 3D graphics engine for first-person games, and John Romero spilling ketchup all over his collection of Metallica albums. The result was the conflux of both a technical and a cultural revolution. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to see it for the first time, getting the same heavily fudged 2D planes from Wolfenstein 3D to simulate angled walls and floors with multiple levels must have been like finding a way to play the trombone with your rectum. And while that lit the spark, the unflinching gore and occasionally present story about blowing the horny bollocks off of demons from actual biblical hell packed just enough spice into the powder cake to ensure a devastating impact. And no small controversy as well. You'd think if anyone would be in favour of blowing the randy vaginas off of those nasty satanic demons, it would be conservative Christian groups. But there I go again, trying to apply logic to hysterical people like a man trying to apply Marmite to a bread slice before it comes out of the toaster. But you don't need me to explain why Doom did alright at the time. Let's analyse the question of whether or not Doom holds up, because the interesting thing is that depending on who you ask, you'll get two very different answers to that question, and both of them start with the word obviously. On the one side, they say obviously it doesn't, Yahtzee, fucking look at it. Impressively fudged as the engine was, it turns out it's actually a lot more efficient and hygienic to play the trombone with your mouth, and it was obsolete the instant polygonal 3D waved its handkerchief from across the dance floor, and all the gore and Satan stuff is kind of laughable in this more enlightened age when the angsty kids who used to doodle pentagrams onto their school books have learned to express themselves in more wholesome ways, like spree killing. And then you have the other side saying, obviously it does, Yahtzee, Doom's the best shooter ever, just play it and you'll remember why, but make sure you're playing the right source port so you can run it in a resolution that wouldn't embarrass a graphing calculator. Oh, you might as well install the brutal Doom mod so you can play it in the original intended spirit, i.e. a game designed by a very unsupervised 14-year-old who received medication instead of hugs growing up. Hey, stop colouring in those pentagrams and explain how you can say this game holds up if you need to mod it this much to still enjoy it. A certain amount of nostalgia might be clouding up your vision here, mate. Influential as it was, it's hard to go back to the original Doom after so many years of other games gradually adding quality of life improvements like proper mouse look and shotgun reload animations with more frames than a Bazooka Joe comic. But Doom 2016. After Doom 3 was trying to be System Shock 2 and everyone got sniffy at it, well, what little they could see of it, Doom 2016 was a massive hit. And why? Because it went back to being like the old Dooms, ergo old Doom still good. Did it though? Doom 2016 worked because of the fast free movement and cathartic violence, and while the original Doom Marine certainly moved like he was 6 tacos deep and looking for the one unoccupied toilet in the shopping mall, Doom 2016 would be nothing without verticality and being able to jump on enemies and tap dance their mandibles off. So if I were to pick its primary influence, it wouldn't be a game that had no fucking jump button. And as for cathartic violence, it was Quake that invented making all an enemy's body parts fly spectacularly away from each other, like former high school friends promising to keep in touch. The jibbing in Doom is all sprite-based and as such is a rather stuffily formal affair, where the jibbed enemies politely arrange themselves into neat piles on the floor. Also, with the exception of the plasma gun, which is like stomping on tubes of spearmint toothpaste while blowing raspberries, Doom's weapons all feel a bit clunky for my tastes. Like the Doom Marine has to bite the end off a Yorkie bar between each shot. Doom 2016 certainly calls back to Doom Not 2016, but it isn't much like it. Really, it's a game of its time, influenced by the lessons of the many, many years of fast-paced cathartic action games that came out in the meantime. Most of what you can get out of retro Doom, you can get better from games that have come since. But having said all that, there has to be something timeless about retro Doom. Google basically any shooter and someone has made a Doom mod trying to recreate it, including Doom 2016. I mean, fuck, that's like trying to remake Jurassic Park with finger puppets and a small dog with a boglin strapped to its face. There has to be something more going on than just nostalgic associations certain people have with the reassuring smile of a cacodemon. And there is. On analysis, there are several things retro Doom provides that you just can't get from newer games anymore. For one thing, the practice of trying to characterize the player by putting their face on the status bar like he'd forgotten to adjust his rearview mirror never really caught on outside id's games. Duke Nukem 3D pointed out you can characterize your dude just as well by having him occasionally quote Army of Darkness and sexually harass everything in a bra. Besides that, Doom offers a very pure gameplay experience with no story interruptions. For all our Lord and Saviour Doom 2016 tries to talk a big game at the start, where the protagonist kicks the shit out of a monitor the moment it starts dribbling exposition at him, there's still that whole scene later on where we have to stand around in the manager's office for 10 minutes while he goes over our performance review. And while Doom's graphics are archaic, I mean, as far as the engine's concerned, you're basically just playing Pac-Man with 3D glasses on and the screen tilted 90 degrees from your face. The visuals are extremely distinct. Modern realistic graphics tend to make everything shadowy and covered in Christmas lights, but when you see a demon in Doom 1, there can be no doubt as to what it is. For all 2.5 animation frames of its big chunky sprite stand as luridly pink as a freshly spanked flamingo and with an actual identifiable expression on its face. For me, it was a point against Doom 2016 that all the demons have generic skull faces with the teeth outside the mouth, which doesn't express anything but an urgent need to floss. So in summary, with Doom's days as a groundbreaker long behind it, it can still at least offer an invigorating simplicity when you're tired of the self-important posturing of new games. Don't get me wrong, I like the innovations of the modern toilet, but there's still something uniquely satisfying about going out into my front garden and pissing on a political canvasser.
So this episode is going to be a little weird, because not only is Doom one of the most documented video games of all time, but I ostensibly already covered Doom way back in the day, along with Doom 2 and Ultimate Doom, as kind of an amorphous blob of doominess, and then sort of covered my coverage of it in the Beginner's Guide episode, and then revisited Doom yet again when talking about Doom 2016. And I kind of want to avoid just repeating myself, at least as much as I can, so to define the scope of this conversation, I want to lay down some ground rules. First, we're talking about the original 1993 release of id Software's Doom. Not Doom 2, not Final Doom, and not Ultimate Doom that has Die Flesh consumed as a fourth episode. In previous videos, I spent a lot of time trying to contextualize the creation of Doom, and I think now would be a good time to contextualize Doom as it was played and what it means to play it now. So we're also not going to be talking about its development so much as the game as it was experienced both in 1993 and in 2020. Because Doom is old. Like, old in a way most video games don't get to be. Most video games will be playable for a hardware generation or maybe two before not only going out of print and becoming difficult to find, but being incredibly difficult to get running. Old hardware breaks, servers disappear, that sort of thing. The fate of most video games that are almost 30 years old is a pleasant but faded childhood memory of middle-aged folks. But Doom is still huge, and not just as a franchise, although certainly that's still booming too. The original game and its engine still have an active mod community. It still has an active player base, complete with YouTubers who offer up commentary on new levels and WADs that have been released recently.
And these maps are all by Pinchy, who is a Doom modder who's been around for a while, very prolific. I'm going to play a few levels from it. This first one is from episode 5, Old Money, and it's called Cross Country.
It's still getting ported to smartphones and ATMs and thermostats, and with a plugin to let GZ Doom run arcade emulators, it's even been ported to Doom itself. In short, Doom is very much still alive in a way that a lot of the games in this series will simply not be. And to that end, I think it's important to look at what the game meant when it was released, but also what it's like to play it today. So first, let's go full subjective games writing, go back to 1993, and talk about what Doom was like to play back then. I'm only 35, so I was only 8 when Doom was released. Consequently, my experience with Doom in 1993 is going to differ pretty drastically from someone who was fully grown. And while being so young plays into that, and we'll get to that in a little bit, there's one big reason why. Shareware. So, I know I said I wouldn't talk about the development of Doom all that much, but this part is something I've glossed over previously and is really relevant to how a lot of people played Doom in 1993. And that is that Doom, much like Wolfenstein 3D before it, was released as a shareware title. I'm not going to sit here and explain what shareware is, both because I feel like most of you know that already, and also because the distribution models of the 90s leading to the consolidation of the 2000s and the resurgence of independent developers in the 2010s could be a whole episode or even series unto itself. The games industry has gone through some changes. Suffice it to say that the shareware angle was an important part of Doom as it was experienced by people my age. Like, to buy the full version of Doom, you needed to call their hotline and place an order with a credit card or money order, a feat not a lot of kids could do, especially for a hyper-violent title. But copying some floppy disks for a free game the developers encouraged you to spread around? That was absolutely a thing kids could do, and often without the knowledge of their elders who, in the early 90s, were still often pretty computer illiterate. I can't tell you how many copies of the shareware version of Doom ended up on school computers I've been to for years by elementary and middle school kids, while much less tech-savvy adults could never quite stop them. To a lot of kids in the mid-90s, Doom was just knee-deep in the dead. And you would think that a game of 10 levels and 5 weapons that could be beaten casually in an hour would burn kids out quickly. But they ate it up for years, over and over again. In part because it was free and available, but also because it was utterly unlike anything anyone had ever seen up until that point. No one was doing things that looked or played quite like Doom at the time of its release. Sure, Ultima Underworld had come out the year before with a fully realized 3D environment, but it was a clunky, slow-paced RPG, not a white-knuckle horror action title. As a shooter, Doom had a speed and immediacy about it that Ultima Underworld lacked. And other shooters of the era were still stodgy, boxy, flat games built out of mostly 90-degree angles. Heck, in 1993, Softdisk was still putting out sequels to Catacomb 3D that looked like this. Now, I'm kind of giving an unfair comparison here, because id Software GPL'd the Doom engine years ago, and we have modern ports capable of running the game silky smooth on contemporary hardware, whereas footage from the other games is mostly emulated, and Doom released at the end of 1993, whereas the other games were earlier in the year. But even if we imagine Doom running a little slower and a little chunkier, it's not hard to see the difference. Dynamic lighting allowed bulbs to flicker on and off in bloody industrial corridors, and strobe as a warning in toxic reactors on the verge of meltdown. Monsters growled from the shadows that were so pitch dark that they had to add a power-up just to give you night vision. And it wasn't just the lighting, but the geometry too. The ability to render arbitrarily angled walls and multiple ceiling and floor heights gave the maps a complexity that stood out among the flat hallways and 90-degree walls of its competitors. While Doom was technically still just a 2D map rendered in pseudo 3D, the illusion was way more powerful when you could walk up some stairs and peek through a window into the next room. Meanwhile, skybox textures meant the entire game wasn't enclosed in an interior or cloaked in fog and shadow. You could see out the window to the horizon beyond. But it wasn't just that the technology was a leap forward, it was that it enabled Doom's dark, abstract, moody tone. I've gone over this before and I don't want to revisit it too much, but Doom really tapped into an action, sci-fi, horror, heavy metal aesthetic that was like being inside of an Iron Maiden album cover, James Cameron's Aliens, and a George Romero zombie film all at once. Much like Star Wars, it had this singular and immediate independent identity that was forged from the still clearly visible interests of the kids who made it. A collage of influences that was more than the sum of its borrowed parts. Doom had an undeniably youthful energy about it. It was angry and angsty and completely obsessed with image and instant gratification in-the-moment gameplay mechanics that showered you in gore and explosions with a single button click. It was all surface and no depth, but what a surface. It was also playfully transgressive for a pop culture smash in the early 90s. And that transgressiveness played two different ways, I think. I imagine to adults at the time that the full version of Doom either felt a little sophomoric or unremarkably edgy. Cartoon gore and pixelated pentagrams weren't exactly scandalous if you were a 20-something who had grown up on 80s slashers or regularly listened to heavy metal bands. But to a 9-year-old in the early 90s Midwest, playing Doom felt like playing with fire. It was tempting but dangerous, a vision not meant for your eyes, but that made it all the more seductive. These days it's hard to picture Doom, a big-budget mega game full of ridiculously cartoony gore, as an edgy, almost dangerous game to play. But you have to remember that in the 90s, hell and damn were still considered serious swear words on network TV, and Bart Simpson was seen as such a controversial character for telling adults to eat his shorts that a lot of schools, including mine, banned shirts featuring the character. We were heading into peak Won't Somebody Think of the Children era, where video games were kids' entertainment that had anti-drug messages in front of them, not occult imagery and impaled bodies. It wasn't hard, even for a kid, to pick up on the tension between what adults were saying and this ominous, bloody, sacrilegious game being kicked around on some floppies all over school. Fun fact, Doom actually released the day after the original congressional hearing on video game violence, which had mostly centered around Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. We were just getting to a point where video game violence was of a high enough level of fidelity to be disturbing and gaining national attention, and Doom released its shareware version, that worked its way through all manner of schools, right as the wave began to swell. That said, I don't think many of the kids playing it knew just how transgressive it could be. Again, I find myself questioning the importance of the shareware version for the impressions it left. John Romero was responsible for pretty much all of Knee Deep in the Dead's levels, save the 4th level, which was started by Tom Hall but finished by Romero, and the big boss fight finale in Phobos Anomaly, which was done by Hall and Sandy Peterson. And I don't know if it's a result of his personal level design style, although Sigil indicates that it isn't, or part of a plan to have the first episode be mostly human military facilities, but it leans hard on the star-based set of textures and traditional boxy rooms and corridors. Doom saves most of its upside-down crosses and fleshy walls and jagged brimstone and mutilated corpses for its later 2 episodes. So while the version traded by kids was still full of guns and blood, the outright gory nightmare scenes and images of altars with still beating hearts and pentagrams mostly didn't make it into our elementary schools. Doom in 1993 was a smash hit. It wasn't the first FPS title, or even id's first FPS title, but it kind of became the archetype of the form simply by being so popular. Heck, until we settled on the term first-person shooter, they were called Doom clones, which makes me the billionth person to complain about the fact that we still call roguelikes, but whatever. Doom cast its shadow over the rest of the 90s and beyond, and the game's fascination with the irreverent, The impulsive, the angry, the youthful, the shallow, and the archetypically male would dominate the aesthetics of the genre for more than a decade after its release. If Wolfenstein 3D was id Software's rejection of Ultima Underworld's slower and more thoughtful mechanics, then Doom was the public resoundingly agreeing, for better or for worse. For a game that left such a tremendous impact on video games, in 2020 the original Doom feels weirdly small. The game's 3 episodes can be beaten in a casual 4 to 5 hours. It's not that hard compared to its sequels and expansions, and it's also not that deep. I'm one of the heathens that prefers Doom 2 to Doom, and I think one of the reasons why, having played them again side by side, is the scope of damage and power, both from the player side and from the enemy side. Doom has the rocket launcher, plasma gun, and BFG, but outside of the big boss fights at the end of each episode, they aren't really all that necessary. There aren't the big bruisers of Doom 2 to really absorb that damage. No Hell Knights or Revenants or Archviles or Mancubi or Arachnotrons. Heck, by Doom 2, Cyber Demons, while rare, are just a regular enemy type and not a boss. But here, in Doom 1, aside from the occasional Baron of Hell in episodes 2 and 3, the toughest non-boss enemies are Cacodemons, which are medium to low threats in Doom 2. Consequently, most of the game is played with the shotgun and minigun, with occasional guest appearances by the rocket launcher or plasma cannon when other ammo is scarce or you see a big group of enemies together. Doom 2 has the ability to scale from small arms fire against zombies up to BFG fire against a city's worth of the undead, to go from juggling chain gun fire against cacodemons to pain them and prevent them from firing, to opening plasma cannon fire on a cyber demon you're trapped in a tight hallway with. Doom, the original, lacks that ability to scale its combat, and the result kind of feels like you're playing a demo of what the game would eventually become. One thing that's a lot easier to take note of when playing through the game today is how it tries to tell a story in its own kinda half-assed way. As stated, Knee Deep in the Dead mostly sticks to a star-based texture set, only really tipping its hand into the demonic influence towards the end when the final fight reveals itself to be inside of a giant pentagram. Players then visit the Demos base in Shores of Hell. This chapter has a lot of teleporters and experimental serum vats and overgrown nature areas that imply some sort of biological research is being done, culminating in a fight with a cyber demon. Between the "our labs have their own built-in upside-down crosses" and the big boss of this episode is a mix of the monsters and our technology, we finally get the sense that maybe something isn't on the up and up with the UAC. But it's all left utterly implicit. Unlike Doom 2016, the bad guys here really are just the demons. Finally, in Inferno, you descend into hell itself, brimstone and jagged rocks and thorny brambles. Levels tend to mix wider open spaces with tight hallways. The levels in episode 2 and 3 also have a tricky sensibility to them, where Knee Deep in the Dead is much more what you see is what you get. Like, the very first level of Inferno has a false wall that isn't used pretty much anywhere else in the game, and E2M6, the Halls of the Damned, actually has a big fake exit button that plunges you into a pit of monsters if you press it. Anyways, yeah, upon finishing Inferno and killing the spider mastermind what planned the invasion, we see the gag with the rabbit and the burning city that sets up Doom 2. And the rabbit actually isn't all that important. It's weird that Daisy has kind of been retconned into being very, very, very critical to the Doom identity. Here in the original Doom, it's just a sting at the end of the game. You think you got away and teleported back to Earth safely, but oh no you didn't. It was a gory gag, the sort of thing that Adrian Carmack got a kick out of. It's also why Keen blows up a bunch. He hated cute stuff. It wasn't until Ultimate Doom was released later in 1995, with the additional Thy Flesh Consumed episode, that Daisy was retconned into being Doom Guy's personal rabbit. Anyways, the game's levels don't really make sense as spaces, but their design does tell a rough sketch of a narrative through environmental storytelling and a few light text blurbs. But the game doesn't really benefit once you pick up on this. Doom's at its best when it's this surreal tone thing, half-rooted in some vague fiction about a Mars base and a gateway to hell, and half just this waking nightmare about an ultra-violent gunfight in techno-gothic dread castles set to midis of metal music. Noticing that there is a bit of story structure to the level progression, a smidge of method to the madness, kinda detracts from the sense that the emphasis on tone over everything else was intentional. It's clear now the game kind of fell ass backwards into it. Its youthful obsession with image and aesthetics and music over being meaningful inadvertently gave the game its own kind of emotional meaning. It didn't reject narrative in order to explore the abstract. It explored the abstract because they were too busy putting in cool stuff to make the narrative coherent. But that's not the worst thing, because as we've learned in 2020, Doom with lore can be really awkward.
You'll make a fine addition to the front lines, stranger.
The demons! They are everywhere. Must kill them all!
Doom in 2020 is also a lot more nebulous as a concept. As exemplified by my previous video, we kind of glom Ultimate Doom and Final Doom and Doom 2 and Doom all together a bit, as if they're a single entity. This wasn't the case. They were released from 1993 through 1996. But also, Doom in 2020 is a game engine that people are still actively developing with. That started to some extent shortly after its release, as its level design tools were made available and hundreds, if not thousands, of custom WADs have been made since 1993. But by GPLing the engine, the game was given even further life. Not just with modern ports of Doom, although I'm certainly thankful for those, but also extensive mods that change how the game plays and feels. And even entire original games, from platformers to horror titles to epic RPGs. Its low fidelity and ability to mock stuff up super quick makes it great for prototyping or sketching out simple ideas. In some ways, Doom in 2020 is less a singular game than an ecosystem where the original WADs by id Software are mostly a starter pack or demo reel for all that Doom can be. Going back and revisiting it today, it's still eminently playable in ways that Catacomb 3D and to some extent Wolfenstein 3D just aren't. It's part nostalgia and part comfort food. But more than that, it's like a base reference text. I called the show Children of Doom not just because of the fun Dune pun, but because Doom was the lodestar that directed so much game development that followed it. A flashpoint that sparked so much of the first-person genre, both the good and the bad. Doom started our pop culture reference-infused, ultra-violent, anti-intellectual, dude-bro shooters. But Doom also inspired FPS games to use spaces to tell stories with minimal words, to engage in abstract emotions rather than literal plot, and to open themselves up to modification. It is, without a doubt, one of the most over-covered, over-discussed games in existence, but it is for a reason. As far as contenders go, there really weren't all that many to choose from. And not just because Doom overshadowed everything else, but because there really wasn't much of note in 1993. There was Terminator Rampage, which mostly helps underscore why Doom succeeded. Most of the enemy weapons are hit scan, removing any defensive play, and movement and shooting are slow and unresponsive next to Doom's snappy running and hair trigger. I do, however, find this footage hilarious. Bram Stoker's Dracula had a wonderful sense of mood, but awkwardly tries to blend an Ultima Underworld-style interface with real-time shooting mechanics, and it never quite clicks. Like Terminator, it's also pretty slow. Elsewhere, Softus continued releasing Catacomb games through 1993 before slowly transitioning to an ISP instead of a disc magazine. If you like Catacomb 3D's hidden walls and spammy combat, then Catacomb Apocalypse is more of that. The only other release that was really of note in 1993 was a small project by Ken Silverman called Ken's Labyrinth.
Welcome to Ken's Labyrinth.
It's mostly a goofy shooter that has an almost Commander Keen Saturday morning cartoon absurd comedy sensibility, and the game itself has largely been forgotten. But it's an important game because it laid the foundations for Silverman to be able to write the build engine, which will undoubtedly power at least a few of the games we cover as we go forward.
Nice job.
Next time, we finally break from id Software to talk about another long-standing first-person shooter developer. It's 1994, and Bungie is about to introduce the first-person shooter to the Mac with Marathon.
it's only natural to imitate success. Throughout video game history, there are countless examples of clones, shameless mimics that ride aboard the coattails of others. Call it inspiration, an homage, or just a plain rip-off. No good idea goes without a few retreads. On rare occasion, a game's influence will be such that it won't just inspire a few imitations, but forge an entirely new genre. Doom is a massively important step in the development of 3D action games. One that defined the first-person shooter and changed gaming forever. So, what inspired such a revolutionary game? What did Doom do that Wolfenstein didn't? And how much of its influence remains in games today? The early 1990s, a time untinged by guilt. When action movies were unironic, thrash metal was at its peak, and unlike the vice-ridden 1980s, all you needed for a good time was pizza and video games. id Software were living the dream. Their previous success brought access to all kinds of hedonistic thrill. But their core passion remained, and their creative freedom was unfettered. Only one obstacle remained. How do you beat a game like Wolfenstein 3D? While most of the id team were working on delivering Spear of Destiny, the first strokes of their next project were being made by John Carmack. He was discontent with Wolfenstein's engine limitations, and with the increasing pace of the PC gaming market, he could afford to target more impressive hardware. Instead of running on a 286 with less than 1 MB of RAM, id's new game would demand at least a 386 with 4 MB, and only a top-of-the-line 486 would suffice for the most impressive performance. Some of Carmack's improvements to the Wolfenstein engine ended up in a game called Shadowcaster, developed by Raven Software, a first-person RPG with similar ambitions to Ultima Underworld. It exists as an evolutionary step between Wolfenstein and Doom, the upgraded tech providing a hint at what was to come later in the year from id. Walls and ceilings were now texture mapped, a corner cut less necessary on newer machines, and a chance to inject more variety both underfoot and overhead, including outdoor areas. Diminished lighting allowed texture colours to be gradually faded into the darkness, allowing for better distance cues and variable lighting. Compared to the static, flat light of Wolfenstein, it made a substantial difference to the game's atmosphere. Another major upgrade was to the level architecture. Grid-based no more, walls could be constructed at any angle, at any position. Better yet, floors and ceilings could now be different heights, allowing for platforms, stairs, windows, and elevators. A massive leap forward in terms of level design. Its new, upgraded engine unlocked huge technical potential. All they needed now was a good idea. Clearly, they were onto something good with the 3D shooter formula, so a further exploration seemed logical. Creative director Tom Hall wanted to revisit Commander Keen, a shift away from realistic violence to a cartoon aesthetic, and a chance to tell a more in-depth story. However, the others were less convinced. It wasn't a compelling narrative that made Wolfenstein 3D a hit, it was its fast-paced and instant action. As John Carmack put it, story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. It was the era of the self-assured action hero, with a hefty arsenal of bombastic one-liners. Yippee-ki-yay, hasta la vista. This is my boomstick. There would be considerable influence from cinema, not through cutscenes or lens flares, but instead as inspiration for the setting, mood, and attitude. Even the name stems from a quote taken from a Tom Cruise film. In The Color of Money, his pool hustling character is asked what resides within his cue case. With a cocky smile, and pause for effect, he retorts, "In here." Doom. Doom's cybernetic heart beats with the rhythm of science fiction. Future soldiers, high-tech weaponry, and isolated installations on a far-flung world. The Alien films are a key influence, to the point where Doom was originally planned as a licensed tie-in, although this idea was ditched in order to retain more creative freedom. Still, there's no shortage of parallel elements. The grizzled Space Marines sent in to investigate an anomaly of unknown origin. The interstellar conglomerates operating at the frontier of human exploration, and questionable ethics that unleash dark, dangerous secrets. The Alien films and Doom also share a common visual inspiration: the disturbing surreality of H.R. Giger. His Necronomicon defined the terrifying look of alien xenomorph, and inspired countless nightmares. Giger's only official contribution to video games was a graphical adventure called Dark Seed and its sequel, but his work's overall influence is far broader. Fearful symmetry amidst an uncomfortable place, somewhere between sex and death, demons and machines. It's this blend that provides the key aesthetic for Doom, a fusion of metallic sci-fi with fleshy hellspawn. The satanic influences originate from id's Dungeons & Dragons sessions, where, at the climax of a lengthy campaign, the entire planet was overrun with demons. No longer constrained by the grid-based stone walls of Wolfenstein, its imagination could run riot, an indulgence of pure, twisted fantasy. A departure from a loose historical basis, from Heil Hitler to Hail Satan. Id have never been particularly afraid of controversial subjects. Still, the devil has all the best tunes, and a game like Doom needed a killer soundtrack. It didn't have to look too far for inspiration. The tunes playing on their office stereo would provide ample material. Tracks evocative of Metallica, Slayer, Pantera, Judas Priest. True, they were lo-fi MIDI renditions, but from the first level to the last, Doom is chock full of thrash riffs. Gory B-movie horror would provide inspiration too, with films like Evil Dead 2 a particular favourite. Its influence is clear in a number of places, such as human enemies possessed by demons, in a similar manner to the Deadites from Evil Dead. The chainsaw and later addition of a double-barreled shotgun are taken straight from the film, and the gory, blood-soaked action that ensues is only natural. Caffeine-fueled, pizza-fed, and a love letter to the culture they consumed. All the elements were starting to come together. A fusion of hell, sci-fi, and fantasy. Alien demons with a twist of Satan. As the end of 1993 approached, so too did Doom's release. Anticipation was sky high, with anxious fans following development through newsgroups and BBS. Confident, it declared that their next game would be Wolfenstein times a million. The hype was real, but could they deliver? Doom's myriad influences ought to make for a crowded mess of ideas, but in the absence of explanation, it works. Here's a shotgun. No more questions. Just get out there and shoot some demons on Mars. Like with Wolfenstein, very little time is wasted. Action is instant, and you're flung into combat straight from the first beat. The level choreography is very similar too. You spawn, weapon in hand, fight through room after room of enemies, and make your way to the exit. Again, levels are episodically grouped, each culminating in a boss fight. The original release comprised 3 such episodes. Knee Deep in the Dead was the first, an introduction to the Mars base on Phobos, and the incursion of Hellspawn into its metallic sci-fi interiors. The second takes you to Deimos, the shores of hell. A descent into diabolical madness, and a border between the human and demon domains. The third was Inferno, a full realization of satanic terror, and a test of the hero's mettle against hell's full fury. This approach was a tried and tested formula. Many elements were retained from Wolfenstein, but Doom was anything but more of the same. For instance, the arcade influences were chamfered to be far less frustrating. Gone were the limited lives. Death was now but a pause, with tougher levels repeatable until cracked. Also absent were the high score tables and the point-scoring pickups. This wasn't Pac-Man. Slaughter is its own reward. Doom also evolved its health economy, with a greater quantity and variety of health pickups. Bonus files litter the levels, with each only providing a single point of stamina, but providing a strong incentive to stay on the move to gradually replenish lost health. Stimpaks provide more immediate relief, and the full-size medpacks and rarer supercharges are a sight for sore eyes when you find yourself in trouble. The addition of armor adds another dimension, with the standard green pickup absorbing a third of all damage until depleted, and the rarer blue suit cutting all incoming damage by half. Fully decked out, taking on the hordes of hell almost seems easy, but a quick comeuppance awaits the overconfident. Health pickups are not necessarily the best solution for every first-person shooter, but one thing is certain: cowering behind cover won't do you any good in Doom. The level design is perhaps the most drastic change from Wolfenstein 3D. The grid-based mazes were gone. Doom's architectural enhancements meant these rigid walls were instead replaced with more freeform, fantastical spaces. Rather than conforming to realistic designs, the Mars base has a more abstract composition than might be expected of a typical sci-fi installation. Rather than shooting through corridor after boring corridor, the chambers and passages are varied, serving an unknown purpose in universe, but making for a far better experience as a game. This detachment from reality also makes for a far more organic transition to a twisted vision of hell as the game unfolds. Animated textures were another new introduction, used to particularly good effect in creating pools of noxious liquid, rivers of blood, and molten lava. Serving as a punishment for falling from an intended path, but also enticing the player with the potential of secrets, the risk of damage versus the reward of hidden supplies. As well as pools of toxic waste, Doom's levels are littered with barrels, of a particularly volatile nature. It isn't the first game to indulge in the trope of explosive barrels, but it might be the first FPS. Doom's world is far more dynamic than Wolfenstein's ever was. Beyond simple doors and push walls, now massive segments of level geometry could move in response to the player. This was limited to up and down motion only, as the binary space partitioning of the level data required considerable pre-calculation. This was perfect for doors, staircases, platforms, and elevators, however, and dynamic level elements are a well-used feature throughout Doom's episodes. Now, the levels could react to the player, and not always through the explicit press of a button. Some triggers were invisible. These new tools gave the level designers ample chance to flex their creativity, unleashing fresh monster closets to repopulate a previously trodden path, drastically altering a level to reveal entirely new areas, or setting traps for greedy players. A tempting power-up atop a well-lit podium in a seemingly quiet room, but redeeming the prize unleashes far more than you might have bargained for. These dynamic triggers are used to great effect in tandem with variable lighting. Dim corridors that recede to distant gloom, strobe lighting, and pitch blackness. Sometimes the game will turn off the lights while simultaneously unleashing an enemy assault. deprived of a vital sense while the guttural growls of demons surround you. Such moments are terrifying and bring the game's horror influence to life. Compared to Wolfenstein's stark VGA palette, the dimmer tones of Doom boast an atmosphere unlike anything else of the era. Dynamic, diverse, and dangerous. The virtual spaces that Doom forged might not resemble reality, but they were the perfect stage for its hellish theatrics. A performance demands players, and our protagonist stands center stage. His story? Not important. His name? Even less so. Doom Guy is a blank slate, a space marine with no identity, stripped of humanity and built for only one purpose. The Spartan detail is intentional, making for an easier self-insert into the player's blood-soaked boots. And in any case, the real stars of the show were the hero's supporting cast. The weapons of Doom follow a similar progression to Wolfenstein, a hierarchy of arms of escalating power. However, there were far more to choose from, defining the classic FPS tradition of a single soldier lugging an impractical arsenal of several heavy weapons. The introduction of different ammunition types adds a new complexity to gameplay, with ammo availability shaping weapon use. The weapons themselves are more varied too, with a blend of hitscan, melee, and projectile options, each mandating different strategy. You start with the pistol, a basic, slow-firing weapon. It's adequate for facing off with the weakest enemies, but not much more. Still, it's better than nothing. Should you run out of ammunition, you'll have to rely on your bare fists to fight, and punching demons can be a dangerous proposition. The Berserk power-up can even the odds a little, multiplying your melee power by a factor of 10, a force capable of turning the basic enemies into a thin red paste. Equally visceral is the chainsaw, an alternate option that rips and tears through flesh in a particularly satisfying way. Getting up close and personal can be dangerous, however, so you'll spend most of your time using the more powerful ranged options. And the pump-action shotgun is a mainstay of Doom shooting action. It's devastating up close, tearing through low-level foes like paper, and is an effective weapon for highly mobile, aggressive use. Rewarding a high-octane style of play is what separates Doom from the more modern trend of cover-based shooters. Instead of cowering in the shadows waiting for a red screen to fade, Doom's action is unrelenting, brutal, and bloody good fun. Unlike the slower-firing shotgun, the chain gun offers continuous firepower for effectively suppressing larger groups. Perfect for those who like to keep the trigger held down, and a far better use of bullets than the anemic pistol. The rocket launcher fires slow-moving projectiles which detonate on impact, dealing massive explosive damage. Great for quickly culling enemies at a distance, but very dangerous at a closer range. Getting caught in your own blast radius will quickly deplete your health. The plasma gun rapidly spits blue balls of energy, effectively interrupting enemy attacks and quickly dispatching even the most robust of foes. Even so, the ultimate weapon on offer is the BFG 9000. A bigger brother to the plasma gun, the BFG takes a while to charge, but can clear an entire room with just a single shot. An impressive arsenal, a variety bolstered since Wolfenstein, and a standard for future games to meet. But what good is such an array of weapons with no bad guys to shoot? Luckily, there's no such shortage of enemies. There's a whole demonic ensemble of Satan claymation. They're drawn as sprites on screen, 2D entities within a 3D world, but each monster is drawn facing multiple directions to permit rotation. In order to expedite the drawing process, many of the monsters were first sculpted as models, photographed, and digitized. This approach gave the larger monsters more naturalistic, believable form, unlike more rigid hand-drawn sprites, These speak of corpulent demon flesh. The realization of these monsters also benefited from the game's sound design, with each type exuding idle noises and announcing their discontent at the player's presence. Coupled with the dark, dangerous chambers of Doom's levels, the addition of guttural sounds in the gloomy distance further enhanced the game's mood. And the battle cry of the greater demons sparks terror like no other. The lowliest of Hell's minions are the human opponents, possessed by some unseen demon force. The first encounter and a common sight throughout the first episode. Some wield machine guns, others shotguns. Both provide easy kills and a steady supply of ammunition. The brown imps fling fireballs from a distance and tear flesh up close. They're tougher than humans, but their attacks are easy to dodge, and they still succumb to a single shotgun blast. The pink demons are much tougher. Sinewy walls of flesh that lack a ranged attack, but make up for it with a fervour for consuming thy flesh. Worse still, some such demons are not pink, but invisible. Spectres that are hard to see in the best of conditions, and an unseen menace in darker spaces. Hell plays home to the lost souls, fire-branded skulls that fling themselves towards you, fast-moving and a tough target to hit. Cacodemons are large red spherical monsters that spew fast-moving fireballs whilst floating in midair. Demon meatballs with a penchant for char-grilled prey. Beyond lie the greater demons. The Hircine Barons of Hell serve as a culmination of Doom's first episode. Satanic brothers that serve as guardians to the gates of the abyss. Standing head and shoulders above their minions, they are unyielding in the face of whatever punishment you mete out, flinging green fireballs at you with all their fury. In later episodes you'll meet yet more Barons, only as regular troops, rather than in a boss-like capacity. Episodes 2 and 3 end with yet greater menace. The Cyber Demon is half goat, half rocket launcher, and all archfiend. Highly resistant and more than happy to dispense his rockets in your direction, it takes a well-supplied marine to even have a hope of dispatching this vile demon. Still, at least you can dodge rockets. Bullets prove a mite more difficult. The ultimate evil is the Spider Mastermind. A squishy brain on stilts, armed with a super chain gun, and a bad attitude. Its instantly landing attack will quickly kill anyone foolish enough to stand in the open. Firing from cover, your best hope for success. Enough firepower, and even the most vile of Hell's denizens will be reduced to a puddle of blood, guts, and brains. Quite the menagerie. With distinct designs, varied tactics and attacks, and eerie presence, Doom's monsters are memorable, frightening, awesome. Between a protagonist laden with guns and a host of evil demonic opponents, what follows next is only natural. Jibbing, that's jibs like giblets, not gibs like goblet, are one of Doom's gory ways. A red shower of body parts and sickening sound effect, your reward for a particularly brutal kill. It's a development of Wolfenstein's death camps, but the gory death animation of the bosses extend to all enemies instead, and can occur as a natural part of gameplay. Doom wasn't the first gory game to feature fleshy jibs, but it codified the name, and its later influence made sure similar dismemberment would remain a hallmark of violent shooters. No guts, no glory. Visceral action is the perfect accompaniment to a first-person perspective. Or better way to experience the thrill of being knee-deep in the dead. Shooting mechanical monsters is good fun, but computer-controlled opponents are predictable, and victory over the AI eventually rings hollow. Single player is great fun, but it's the multiplayer that really gave Doom longevity. And in the years following its release, the sounds of competitive combat were commonly heard anywhere near a computer network. Such was its popularity that network administrators were often forced to take action. The congestion caused by players could bring even the largest network to a standstill. It is the game that coined the term deathmatch and gave birth to a now long-standing tradition of digital carnage. Another important contribution to Doom's longevity was its modability. It wasn't the first game to support user-created content, but it was very successful in this regard. Its generosity played a key role, providing level editors and tools for editing the game's files. Content creators were able to make new levels, add new graphics and sound, all with relative ease. These mods were packaged in convenient files called WADs, an acronym for Where's All the Data? A single file easily distributed, and containing anything from minor tweaks to a full-blown total conversion. The most popular WADs drew from pop culture, with locations, characters, graphics and sound bites gratuitously taken from film and TV. Others indulged in more original work, with imagination unfettered and the keys to Doom's creation. With the dawn of the internet, there was no shortage of enthusiastic talent keen to share their skills. The right game at the right time. Doom led to a burgeoning modding community and forged a tradition that endures today. Groundbreaking technology, an atmospheric and scary setting, fast-paced and addictive gameplay, frantic multiplayer deathmatch, and fully moddable to boot. Truly a complete package, and the first episode was free. Who could resist an offer like that? Doom proved a success by every measure. The fans loved it, the gaming press praised it at every turn, and it sold by the millions. It repeated the shareware success story of Wolfenstein. With the first episode available for free, copies of the game spread like wildfire, with an estimated 10 million installations. While the shareware model had proven successful, the retail market for PC games had expanded since the days of Wolfenstein, and boxed copies could attain a broader reach than mail order. The Doom franchise first found its way onto shelves with the rapid release of its sequel in 1994, with Doom 2: Hell on Earth. It was not a major change from the original shareware release, retaining the same engine and overall format, but it came with an all-new set of levels, enemies, graphics, and an extra weapon. The Super Shotgun is a defining difference between Doom and Doom 2, boasting double the barrels and nearly triple the damage. It provides an extension of the shotgun's usefulness, with even more close-range power. And while it fires more slowly than the pump action, the ability to take out crowds of enemies with a single spray of buckshot is quite satisfying. A host of new enemies await your wrath, complementing Doom's original set and providing new challenges and hazards. A new human enemy, the chain gun guy, is amongst the first you'll meet. A little tougher than his brothers, and a lot meaner. The Hell Knights are lesser barons of hell, weaker than their superiors, but still very much a threat. The spooky rocket-launching skeletons are known as the Revenants, a clattering assembly of shrieking undead. The grotesque mancubuses have a little more meat on their bones, a corpulent pile of flesh and rockets. Miniature versions of the spider mastermind, known as the Arachnotrons, are equipped with a powerful plasma weapon. The pain elementals resemble brown cacodemons, but instead of fireballs, they spawn lost souls instead. And the Arch-Vile, a mysterious figure, quite happy to immolate all in their path. A host of new denizens, a host of new ways to die. The 30 new levels were presented as a single episode, Hell on Earth. A diverse set, with some more mundane locations, and some truly evil, hellish labyrinths. tricks and traps galore as the game more confidently exploits player expectation to endless surprise. More creative levels like Barrels of Fun offer the player a dilemma, where the need to shoot is tempered by the reluctance to self-destruct. With the experience gained from the first 3 episodes, the level designs were more confident, whimsical, and certainly more devious. Doom 2 gave ardent fans another slice of shooting action, and its retail presence introduced it to a new audience. Between it and its shareware incarnation, Doom would dominate the home computer gaming scene. If you had a PC, you had to have Doom. Doom would go on to boast a larger install base than Windows, a claim no game since could possibly make. Such was its influence that it would define the first-person shooter genre. For years after its release, any FPS would be dubbed a Doom clone. Such an honour was not without warrant. There was certainly no shortage of attempts to out-Doom Doom. With its games enjoying massive commercial success, plenty of other developers were keen to taste a slice of the Doom clone pie. Nascent studio Bungie were then champions of the Mac gaming scene, and Marathon in 1994 provided 3D shooting action for the rival platform. Even LucasArts, best known then for their point-and-click adventure games, leveraged the Star Wars IP into the first-person shooter domain with Dark Forces in 1995. The most prolific Doom rivals came from its former publisher for Wolfenstein, Apogee Software, who rebranded as 3D Realms in 1994. Ken Silverman's build engine would drive their games, most notably Duke Nukem 3D. A game clearly made in Doom's image, but with a swagger and style all of its own. Later titles like Blood, Shadow Warrior, and Redneck Rampage are generally well remembered. Not so much as technical innovators, but as varied, fun experiences with an abundance of charm. However, none of these imitations are remembered quite as fondly as the real thing. Attempts to out-Doom Doom were, of course, doomed. That's not to say all versions of Doom are equal. The DOS version was the definitive, but the covetous consoles were also granted ports of varying quality of their own. The 16-bit consoles of the era lacked the grunt needed to shift textures at the required rate, leading to some severe compromises. The Super Nintendo version made valiant use of the Super FX2 chip, but while this coprocessor assistance made the game viable, its frame rate was poor and resolution inadequate. Even the 32-bit power of Sega's ill-fated 32X add-on couldn't muster a faithful rendition. While its frame rate was superior, nearly every other aspect suffers. Lighting effects were reduced, as was the colour palette and number of textures, and the music was terrible. It would take a new generation of consoles to deliver something more convincing. And as a new wave of 32-bit and 64-bit machines trickled in, each tried their hand at matching the PC. Doom was the must-have next-gen game, and the Atari Jaguar, 3DO, and Sega Saturn all made an attempt. But despite their increased power, the conversions were underwhelming. The marketing hype around bit counts fell flat in the face of poor performance. The PlayStation version was more convincing, with full-screen graphics that ran well, and novel features such as alpha transparency and coloured lighting. There were some concessions. The level geometry was simplified compared to the PC version, and RAM limitations restricted the use of some assets. Not all monster types could appear in the same level, for instance. Still, compared to earlier ports, it was far more playable, and the PlayStation's more confident 3D performance no doubt played a part in its success. Perhaps the most impressive version of Doom on the consoles came in 1997 for Nintendo's new platform, with Doom 64. With new graphics, levels, and story, it is a drastic departure from the original Doom, and is generally considered a spin-off. The N64's analog control stick is far better suited to FPS movement than a digital D-pad, and was a step towards the twin-stick controls used on consoles today. Between Doom 64, Turok, and GoldenEye, the viability of first-person shooters on a console had arrived. Meanwhile, on PC, the original Doom saw a retail release in 1995 as the Ultimate Doom, capitalising on those who missed the shareware release and adding a bonus fourth episode, Thy Flesh Consumed. With the widespread success of Doom, there was a thirst for more, and expansion packs were one means of slaking this desire. The master levels for Doom 2 boasted 20 additional levels from a multitude of designers, curated by id and given a retail release. Similarly, Final Doom combined two 32-level episodes into one package: TNT Evolution and the Plutonia Experiment. These episodes were community-created efforts, officially licensed and distributed as a commercial product, but they wouldn't exist if not for id's accepting policy towards modding. Aside from the scores of user-made modifications, the Doom engine was put to good use in a commercial setting with two releases from Raven Software. Heretic in 1994 built on the work they did with Shadowcaster, an atmospheric fusion of Doom with RPG elements, with magic in the stead of firearms amidst a gothic fantasy world. A sequel, Hexen Beyond Heretic, followed in 1995, further expanding on the Doom paradigm with a dark fantasy twist. With a choice of 3 character classes, each with their own weapons, and a deviation from Doom's linear level progression, Raven served up a counterpart to Doom that had familiar choreography, but with merits all of its own. The RPG elements in Strife were even more developed, with hub worlds, relatively seamless level transitions, and NPCs with dialogue. All this is blended with familiar shooting action, crossbows, flamethrowers, and enemies lurking in corridors. It is probably the most advanced use of Doom's engine, although by the time of its release, the technology was starting to show its age. By 1996, the Doom engine's technical edge had been lost. The dawn of hardware acceleration had arrived, and full 3D engines were the future. What do you get if you cross a violent shooter with a marketing campaign for a breakfast cereal? Good question, glad you asked. Chex Quest is the result of such a bizarre union. A total conversion of Doom's gameplay with the violence removed. Instead of killing your alien opponents, you must zorch them back to their home planet. Given away with boxes of cereal, the first video game distributed this way, Chex Quest found a grateful audience in the younger market. A far cry from Doom's more mature audience, but targeting adults grants no exemption from controversy. Video games were taking some flack in the media at this time. Games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were upheld as a cause for censorship, eventually leading to the industry's self-regulation of the ESRB. Satanism has been a source of alarm for centuries, and even in recent decades has proven to provoke concern. From Ouija boards, Dungeons and Dragons, and heavy metal, any form of entertainment that dared tread near the occult triggered a new moral panic. And Doom was another sacrificial goat at the altar of outrage. Can video games train someone to kill? Flight simulators can teach someone to fly, so the use of technology to train infantry seems plausible enough. In 1996, the United States Marine Corps expressed an interest in using computer-based wargames as a means for training. A modification for Doom 2, called Marine Doom, was the result. Intended for cooperative play with a fire team of 4 Marines, the scenario was designed for teamwork and supporting fire in the face of an enemy threat. Military exercises are one application, but the simulation of cold-blooded murder is another thing entirely. in 1999, Doom found itself blamed for the death of 13 in a high school shooting. The Columbine Massacre. The pair responsible were avid fans of violent first-person shooters, and one had even created his own custom levels for Doom. In the wake of such a tragedy, there was no easy explanation, but video games alone are no cause for atrocity. Doom emerged relatively unscathed from this contention, despite numerous lawsuits and no end of media criticism. But even now, in a more enlightened age, video games have not seen the end of outrage. After the release of Final Doom in 1996, the franchise was left fallow in favour of its next big project. A pause that would persist until the 2004 release of Doom 3. To say that expectations were high would be an understatement. Doom was a legend amongst FPS, and so nothing less than a revolution would suffice. While it remained a capable developer, they were not the same dynamic team of the early 90s, nor was game development quite the same. Nevertheless, with John Carmack behind Doom 3's new engine, id Tech 4, from a technical perspective, there were some very impressive new features. A host of new graphical techniques were now supported, stuff we take for granted today. Bump mapping, normal mapping, and specular highlighting. Dynamic per-pixel lighting sold the game's atmosphere, and the illumination, or absence of it, made for a tense, terrifying experience. Your only weapon against the darkness was a flashlight, carving a feeble yet essential beam through the gloom. So you were forced to exchange sight for the ability to defend yourself. This design choice was not universally liked. A duct tape mod was a popular addition, permitting the use of a weapon and light simultaneously. A later re-release, Doom 3 BFG Edition, adopted this change into official gameplay, along with graphical and audio enhancements for more modern machines. An expansion pack developed by Nerve Software followed in 2005, Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil. Much like Doom 2 did for the original, it added new levels, enemies and weapons, including the legendary double-barreled shotgun and a weapon resembling Half-Life 2's gravity gun called the Grabber. Otherwise, it plays in much the same fashion as the vanilla game. Gloomy corridors on Mars with myriad demons prepared for a welcome. Doom 3 was a success both critically and commercially. After all, it was a full-blown sequel to Doom. But it's fair to say that it doesn't quite live up to the original. From an audio-visual perspective, it was spectacular. But there was little evolution in terms of gameplay, an over-reliance on jump scares, and not much deviation from the standard FPS fare of the era. Still, its release renewed interest in the franchise, to the point where someone thought it might be a good idea to make a Doom movie, with Carl Urban starring alongside The Rock. Films based on video games don't have a particularly good track record, and Doom didn't do much to change this. But the action-packed first-person sequence almost makes it worth the price of admission. The same year saw the release of Doom RPG, a phone game designed for the then emerging mobile market. Gameplay is turn-based and movement grid-based. Nevertheless, an impressive distillation of Doom's essence onto the weak pocket hardware of the time. Doom Resurrection was another mobile title made for iPhones in 2009. A pared-down version of Doom 3, this time as a rail shooter. A fun enough diversion for idle thumbs, but Doom's strength always lay in its classic FPS formula. What would we do without the first-person shooter? They remain a common sight today, and while we might be past the recent peak of modern military-themed games, the genre isn't going away anytime soon. Doom's DNA runs through them all. If not through having direct influence, then via another game that does. Half-Life is another seminal game that took direct inspiration. A cataclysmic invasion of a sci-fi installation. Aliens galore. and an abundance of toxic waste throughout its levels. Similarly, Doom's lack of cutscenes or cinematics laden with exposition laid the foundations for experiential storytelling, relying on in-engine events to tell a story. Halo Combat Evolved is a game which divides the old school from the new. Defined by its defiance of Doom's conventions, with its 2-weapon limit, regenerating shields, and large-scale vehicular combat. However, for all its differences, enough of Doom remains. Both share heavy Aliens influence, with their sci-fi setting and grizzled space marines. High-tech installations, a varied array of enemy types, and a protagonist almost entirely stripped of identity. Doom's blank slate character paved the way for the generic leads seen in what feels like most modern games. A shaven-headed average Joe designed to tread the path of least financial risk. The horror elements of Doom, variable lighting and invisible triggers, have been mirrored in games like System Shock, Fear, and other such scary FPS, with scripted moments designed to surprise and/or terrify the player. Without their lack of light, gloomy corridors and areas cast into blackness, games like Dead Space or Alien Isolation wouldn't have half the impact they manage. Today, Doom's innovations might seem obvious, and perhaps they are, but it lit the way for future games to tread, and its massive popularity cemented its influence. Modern games have tampered with Doom's purity, however. No longer do games give you the reins to their experience, instead forcing you down more linear corridors in the name of cinematic impact. Some of the longing for old-school gameplay is seen through rose-tinted glasses, and even the classics are not without faults. Doom is far from ready to retire, however. It still has an indomitable spirit. More recently, interest in the game has been rekindled and given a fresh coat of red paint with the help of a mod. Brutal Doom. A fundamental overhaul with some drastic changes. The core is unmistakable fast-paced arcade action, but there are more modern elements grafted on. A more reactive HUD with bloodstains and bullet holes. Smoother animations, and more of them. AI buddies, reloads, new enemy attacks, and more gore than ever. The transformation might offend some purists, but it is unquestionably exhilarating. A fusion of elements from modern games with a classic sensibility. And goblet loads of blood for good measure. Perhaps FPS of the future will take heed. And perhaps the franchise will see a return to glory. For a new Doom waits in the wings. A decade since Doom 3, and over 2 since the originals. At the time of writing, a 4th Doom is mere months away. One hell of a pair of boots to fill, but the recent success of Wolfenstein: The New Order might be a good sign. Can the reboot live up to the name which it dares to bear? Will its violence fly unflinching in the face of outrage? Shall it inspire the same thrill the original did back in '93? Only time will tell. Every inch the compelling experience. The world was ill prepared for a game like Doom. An amalgam of pop culture, it borrowed heavily from its era, but paid back the debt with interest. From influenced to influential, and an impact that resonates today. A new genre forged, and gameplay choreography re-rehearsed countless times. Doom's success invited others to follow in its footsteps. And why not? It's only natural. There is magic in Doom's heart. It's primitive, still raw, and the essence of action beats throughout its chambers. 2 decades later, and it still kicks ass. Of course, it weren't quite done yet. Doom might be the pinnacle of their contribution to gaming, but their next project would still manage to shake things up. Thank you for watching, and until next time, farewell.
At Aspenton.
Doom, and I still hate the practice of sequels with identical names, so from now on I will refer to it as Doom, was promising to be the kind of classic-style FPS that I enjoy very much, which immediately made me suspicious. You're a hardcore retro shooter focusing on fast pace and mobility while fighting off hordes of monsters? Well, it won't be truly retro unless it's level-based with open-ended maps and key hunting. Oh, it does have that. Alright then, but you couldn't resist having weapon reloading. That's the one thing that shooter developers always put in these days without considering how it screws up the pace of, oh, there's no reloading. Alright, what the fuck are you up to, Bethesda? For me, this is like when an attractive young woman comes up to me in a bar and says, you know, I am so attracted to aging socially awkward hairy men who play too many video games. Why not buy me a drink and then perhaps a house? Perhaps I've gotten too defensive and cynical from a lifetime of disappointment. But after playing through Doom, I think I've come to realise that people who come on to me might not necessarily be gold-digging harlots. Some of them are just trying to get back at their dad. I didn't know what to expect of Doom, but I did know what I didn't want. I didn't want Doom 3, the game that was 90% pitch blackness and 10% audio logs. So hopes weren't high when Doom opens with the protagonist having to listen to a voice on a computer screen, until 5 seconds into the speech our hero smashes the monitor like a confused gorilla, then starts shooting zombies and never stops. Doom certainly seems to have a firm understanding of its audience, because while there is a plot going on, the player character couldn't give a half ounce of deep-fried shit. If you want to know the plot, then pause the game and read all the fluff text in the character and location database, sipping daintily from your delicate pink teacup full of pussy juice, while the game waits patiently for you to strap your bollocks back on and get back in the fray. Not the most organic way to bring story across, but what the hell else could they have done? Have Jiminy fucking Cricket sitting on your shoulder whispering stories in the brief pauses between the sounds of partially muscled bone being crushed between your erect bulletproof nipples? For what it's worth, the plot is stock amoral corporation sci-fi subcategory 9, Weyland-Yutani type, has stock evil science motivation subcategory 12, energy crisis, and they have found the foolproof and completely unlikely to backfire solution of extracting energy from the Christian afterlife. I don't know why they felt they had to stick to hell. You'd have thought a few solar panels around God's beard would have done the job. Sadly, not Weyland-Yutani forgets to screen its employees for death metal fans, and someone unleashes the hordes of hell on the Mars base. You, meanwhile, are a mythical demon-slaying warrior who was being kept in hell's drunk tank after the last time you smashed the place up, awakened to once again show the demons what for, and dress up like a Lego astronaut. Doom's gameplay is a surprisingly faithful update of the original Dooms. No, you couldn't double jump in the originals, but you could move faster than a conservative political campaigner through a minority district, so it's still in the spirit of things. The combat is distinctly mechanics focused. It doesn't make conventional sense that chainsaw murders make the victim burst into piles of ammunition, or that smashing their head in makes them disgorge bandages and Mars bars, but it does from a mechanical perspective, because the chainsaw is what you use when you're low on ammo, and brutal murder is the game's intended solution for moments of high stress, as well as moments of low stress and all the moments in between. I wasn't sure about the whole glory kill thing. They're called glory kills for one thing, which sounds like what you'd call stabbing someone to death with your knob through a hole in a cubicle wall, but they're actually pre-animated takedown moves, a thing that modern action games persist in having that have a tendency to kill the pacing as assuredly as a passport checkpoint on a roller coaster. To Doom's credit, they are very quick. It's more an Israeli passport checkpoint than an American one, but considering you can glory kill every single fucking monster just by getting their health low, it gets repetitive. Maybe it should have been more of a reward, like in Resident Evil 4, how you have to kneecap dudes before you can suplex them. It stops being memorable when I kill every single Baron of Hell by pulling their horn off and wimpily swiping their face with the wet end, like I'm giving them a dirty Sanchez. Actually, before I continue with my list of whinging nitpicks, perhaps I should clarify that I do recommend Doom, and had more fun with it than I've had with most AAA shooters lately, and that being the case, it would be remiss of me not to list what issues I did have, but none of them are deal breakers, and it doesn't actually bother me that much that most of the NPC dialogue sounds like they're trying to do an impression of Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget. Okay? Okay, the loading times are a bit of an arse, and in levels with jumping puzzles over instant kill death pits, they're a lot of an arse, but they were a triple stacked arse with whipped butter on the side when the game was treating me hammering the ledge grab button as more of a blue sky suggestion than a command. Relatedly, this is definitely a game that benefits from having the mouse and keyboard rather than the controller, because the controller's best suited to wheeling yourself around an arena like a runaway dessert trolley on a chest-high wall safari, not so much for simultaneously jumping one way, looking in another, grabbing a ledge, shooting a dude, and tying up your shoelaces. The game's a little bit crazy with the upgrades. There's character upgrades, runes that give you passive buffs, buffs and the main currency is weapon upgrades. They give that shit away like condoms at a Planned Parenthood clinic. You killed all the monsters, weapon upgrade. You went into a secret, weapon upgrade. You came back out of the secret, weapon upgrade. Why the fuck not? Thing is though, you can only use them to upgrade the special alternate attacks each weapon has, a lot of which I didn't get much use out of when a good hard shotgun blast will answer most of a demon's probing interview questions. But hey, if the tokens are too easy to get but the upgrades are kinda shitty, then I guess those issues cancel each other out. And the upgrades must have been having some effect, because I thought the game was a bit easy by the end, when it felt like it had no more tricks up its sleeve. Oh goodness, I killed the entire wave of monsters and 2 Barons of Hell spawned. This will call upon all my training that I had 5 minutes ago the last time this happened. The monsters never took me by surprise, the way they'd always spawn in with a red glowy effect, a shower of confetti, and an English butler reading their names out loud. I don't want the Doom 3 thing where you pick up a small health pack and 6 hidden doors fly open to reveal Hell's entire buggery squadron, but there's gotta be a middle ground. Oh yeah, and the grenades feel a bit wimpy. I throw it, there's a little fut, and then all the zombies around it fall apart with embarrassment. I think that's it. As I say, my problems are mere flicked bogeys sticking to the edges of a perfectly solid core. Maybe it's rather blatantly pandering to my generation of gamers, but this is the good kind of pander. The kind that gets all the bamboo and has sex once in a while. Yes, it's the explosive new doom that everybody's talking about, in which humanity faces extinction at the hands of an all-pervading terror. But that's a bit too depressing, so let's talk about a new video game instead. Doom Eternal, the other thing that's been fucking my year up, by sitting at the end of Q1 with its mouth open like a fucking trapdoor spider and scaring off every other big release. Doom Eternal this, Doom Eternal that, the children are dying. Doom Eternal! Hey, I finished cleaning the menswear section of this department store, which section should I do next? Oh, could you Doom Eternal? Doom Eternal! Doom Eternal is the sequel to Doom 2016, in which we step back into the chonky elephantine boots of
the Doom Slayer.
And the plot picks up where Doom 2016 left off, give or take an explanation for how we escaped from Mars and where we got a fucking spaceship from, or how demons have conquered most of planet Earth. Okay, so maybe it doesn't start where Doom 2016 left off, although the demons invading Earth bit we could probably have safely assumed. Ooh, what has humanity learned from the previous disaster? The usual amount, somewhere in the region between bugger and all. How timely. But as for how
the Doom Slayer
got here, maybe that was explained in a DLC or a comic book somewhere. And incidentally, I do appreciate how it's now canon that
the Doom Slayer
does actually talk like he did in the Doom comic book, like an abattoir worker on enough coke to floor an elephant seal. Doom Eternal's starting point is the fast and chaotic arena shootouts of Doom 2016, the thing that our Doom retrospective video established isn't actually that much like the original Doom because it's more complex than playing marbles on a kitchen counter covered in several interesting varieties of ketchup. But that seems to have made Doom Eternal a bit self-conscious, as it's very deliberately redesigned a lot of its monsters and pickups to look more like how they did in classic Doom. You wouldn't be trying to pander now, would you, Doom Eternal? No, of course not. Would you like us to change it? Let us pander to you not wanting us to pander. But lest you think we're regressing, gameplay is leaning even harder on the complexity lever. I always felt I could have done without a lot of that weapon upgrade business in Doom 2016, when I'd finished getting all the upgrades for all the guns I was capable of remembering that I had while panicking, and now there's so many more things I have to remember that I have. 8 guns with 2 alternate fire modes each, frag grenades, ice grenades, blood punch. No, that isn't what they serve at Hell's singles mixers. The one-hit kill sword, the chainsaw, the flamethrower, the candlestick maker. You still get ammo pickups from your off-the-books chainsaw mastectomy clinic, and now you get armor from using your flamethrower because the searing heat is making the demon's pocket change fuse together. No, it still doesn't make the slightest sense in context. Oh, who the fuck needs context, yards? It's fast arcadey fun combat. Did you miss the instructions? Step 1, rip. Step 2, tear. Step 3, lunch. What you're talking about, viewer, is combat having a sense of abandon and catharsis, but I have trouble getting into that mood when every time I burst into a room full of low-level mobs I have to stop and weigh things up. Health and armor both need a boost. Should I set fire to these lads before I chainsaw their legs off? The more strategic nature of it might turn some people off if they'd rather just pull out the super shotgun, say, hey, does this barrel smell like cordite to you, and change the atmosphere of the room from 70% nitrogen to 90% vaporized sexual organ. Oh, for those happier times when I was a youthful, carefree murderer. And speaking of killing the mood, when a new monster or boss is introduced and it poses for the camera, its 17 disfigured tits trembling under the flickering hell gloom, and my whitening knuckles are equally divided between my shotgun hilt and my oversized ball sack in preparation for the battle, what I don't want to happen next is a tutorial message slamming the brakes on the pace to say, it's a new monster, here's precise instructions on how to kill it. Lucky you weren't left to figure it out for yourself, you might have gotten dangerously engaged. Yeah, I know, turn tutorials off, Yahtzee. But as I say, they've only added more complexity to the combat, so I was afraid the game might suddenly toss me the enchanted egg slicer of Ravi Shankar and wouldn't tell me how to use the fucking thing. And while I'm playing pocket billiards in my grumpy trousers again, the new traversal stuff is fun and all, with the air dashes and the bouncing off poles like a Nazi jackboot in the late 1930s, but now that we can reach the furthest crannies of the map, exercise some fucking consistency in your level design so I'm not constantly jumping for scenery that looks blatantly ledge-esque and sliding off invisible walls into the abyss. This is a game that constantly encourages you to hunt for secrets, I'll remind you. It's beckoning with one hand and readying vicious nipple cripples with the other. The combat we loved is still here. I had two small quibbles with Doom 2016, the monster design being kind of flat and expressionless, and some of the glory kills lacking a certain impact. Sometimes we'd rip a demon's horn off and then just sort of wipe his face with it like we're a behind-schedule makeup artist. Both of those issues are addressed in Doom Eternal, but they're addressed as part of a general scattershot attempt at improvement that mostly entailed adding more of everything, for better and for worse. Some of the new monsters are fun, some are annoying. Thinking of you, Tentacle. You do not deserve a page in the bestiary. All you do is sit there and give us an unavoidable slap if we come too close. You're not a monster, you're a timely and useful reminder of the importance of social distancing. And it's funny how the game is leaning more into the arcadey retro vibe with the redesigned pickups and simultaneously leaning more into serious storytelling, which is about as welcome in my Doom 2016 as a jittery skunk in an eyewash station.
The Doomslayer
Is an unfettered chaotic id who only wants to kill demons and find collectible Happy Meal toys. In other words, he's the player of a mindless shooter game. But the central gag of the character is that all the other characters in the plot are looking for meaning and cosmic/religious significance in his actions where none truly exists. He just doesn't give a shit. That's the joke. Very funny, ha ha ha. But in Doom Eternal, when there are entire levels devoted to traipsing through empty hallways learning the history of
the Doomslayer
and the origin story for how he came to not give a shit, and we're beset by cutscenes and dialogue and codex entries filling us in on the makers of Errant and their history with the Sentinels of Argent Nu and their long tradition of shit and the not giving thereof, then suddenly the game itself is the one projecting unnecessary meaning onto the dude who doesn't actually give a shit, and the joke is at the expense of the story writers. In summary, Doom Eternal's still good, but its attempts to broaden appeal across the board has resulted in a little bloat and lack of discipline. Both story and gameplay would benefit from keeping in mind the rule of KISS. Keep it simple and shit-faced.
John Freeman, who was Gordon Freeman's brother, was one day in an office typing on a computer. He got an email from his brother that said that aliens and monsters were attacking his place and asked him for help. So he went. John Freeman got his computer shut down and went on the platform to go up to the roof of the building where he left his motorcycle and normal people clothes because he was in his office lab coat. John Freeman got on his motorcycle and said, "It's time for me to live up to my family name and face full life consequences." So he had to go. John Freeman ramped off the building and did a backflip and landed. He kept driving down the road and made sure there was no zombies around because he didn't have weapons. The countrysides were nice, and the plants were singing, and the birds and the sun was almost down from the top of the sky. The mood was set for John Freeman's quest to help his brother where he was. John Freeman looked around the countryside and said, "It's a good day to do what has to be done by me and help my brother to defeat the enemies." John Freeman was late, so he had to drive really fast. A cop car was hidden nearby, so when John Freeman went by, the cops came and wanted to give him a ticket. Here John Freeman saw the first monster because the cop was possessed and had head crabs. "I can't give you my license, officer," John Freeman said. "Why not?" said the head crab officer back to John Freeman. "Because you are a head crab zombie." So John Freeman shot the officer in the head and drove off thinking, "My brother is in trouble there," and went faster. John Freeman had to go faster like the speed of sound and got there fast because Gordon needed him where he was. John Freeman looked at road signs and saw Raven Home with some on writing under it saying, "You shouldn't come here." So John Freeman almost turned around but heard screaming like Gordon, so he went faster again. John Freeman rode in and did another flip and jumped off his motorbike, and the motorbike took off some head crab zombies in front of John Freeman. John Freeman smiled and walked fast. John then looked on the ground and found weapon, so he picked it up and fired fast at zombie ghosts in front of a house. John Freeman said, "Zombie ghosts, leave this place." And the zombie ghosts said, "But this is our house." And John Freeman felt sorry for them because they couldn't live there anymore because they were zombie ghosts. So he blew up the house and killed the zombie ghosts, so they were at peace. Then John Freeman heard another scream from his brother, so he kept walking really faster to get where he was. Raven Hold'em was nothing behind the countryside. There was no birds singing, and the paths were dead, and the dirt was messy and bloody from headcrabs. When John Freeman got to where the screaming was started, he found his brother, Gordon Freeman, fighting the final boss. And Gordon said, "John Freeman, over here!" So John Freeman went there to where Gordon Freeman was fighting. John Freeman fired his bullets from the gun really fast, and the bullets went and shot the final boss in the eyes, and the final boss couldn't see. Gordon Freeman said, "It's time to end this once and for all," and punched the final boss in the face, and the final boss fell. John Freeman said, "Thanks, I could help, bro." And Gordon Freeman said, "You should come here earlier next time," and they laughed. The laugh overed quickly, though, because John Freeman yelled, "Look out, bro!" and pointed up to the top of the sky. Gordon Freeman looked up and said, "No!" John Freeman, "Run out of here as fast as you can!" And John walked real fast out. John looked back and saw Gordon get stepped on by the next boss, and he was mad and angry. "I'll get you back, evil boss!" John Freeman yelled at the top of lungs. To be continued.